everyone. Lovely to see all of you in attendance and joining us today. My name is Joanne Duklas, and I am the Executive Director for the GDN Network, a European trust focused on digitization as an enabler for helping learners achieve access to education and work. We have three wonderful panelists with me today, experts in the field of lifelong learning, prior learning assessment, and transfer. And I'm also excited to introduce them, and we'll be having a conversation around these important topics as we seek to work together to remove barriers for our citizens around the world and help to recognize their learning, whether it's informal, non-formal, or co-curricular, what have you. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Anne-Marie, Judy, and Borhene, experts in the field, and I'm going to ask you to quickly introduce yourself, beginning with our MOU partner at PCCAT, Anne-Marie Lyseng. Over to you, Anne-Marie.
Thanks, Joanne. Morning, everyone, and or afternoon, depending on your time zone, or almost evening in some cases. Very excited to be here on behalf of PCCAT. Got a number of different interesting hats in the universe. I think just to highlight that, happy to reflect both our PCCAT MOU with Groningen and looking at the really truly representing the network of networks concept and trying to connect our Canadian partners together and some of the information that I will share. And in addition to that national organization role, I also have my Alberta hat as Senior Manager for the Alberta Council on Admissions and Transfer, ACAT Secretariat, and happy to be with my fellow CATs as well in the CAT-CAN network and other certain fun and adventure with the RUC PCCAT Transcript and Transfer Guide Working Group, the PEST Geocodes User Group, a number of other different pieces to the puzzle for sure. And of course, I would be remiss without saying roots in these lands we call Alberta and Canada here on Treaty 6 territory, where I get to speak with you today and share a really strong passion for collaboration and support for learners' education, mobility, and success.
Thanks so much, Anne-Marie. And just for those of our audience, PCCAT refers to the Pan-Canadian Consortium on Admissions and Transfer, and they're a representative group that includes government, industry, institutions, and so on from across the country, as well as some with an international foot, if shall we say, and they're dedicated to enhancing mobility across the 13 provinces and territories. Judy, please say hello to our colleagues today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Joanne. Thanks for having me. And thank you to my fellow panelists as well. It's great to be here. So my name is Judy Tavares. I'm the Manager of Student Mobility and Pathways at Humber Polytechnic in Toronto. So what that really means is that I manage the day-to-day operations of all things recognition of prior learning with an amazing team that's here really to every day advocate for our adult, mature, non-traditional, non-direct, so many different words and names for our adult learners. But we're really here to advocate for the recognition of prior learning in whatever form that might take, whether it be credit transfer, pathways, PLAR, letters of permission, a whole slew of things that we do here. And so a big part of my job is really the advocacy and breaking down barriers at the institution for these learners, as well as within Ontario. I sit on the ONCAT HODA board, as well as OCAS non-direct boards as well, again, promoting RPL and non-direct learners' needs in those spaces. And I'm also very proud to be a CAPLA board member, which is the Pan-Canadian Association for Prior Learning and Assessment. And I've been on that board for 4 years. So all in all, working with adult learners has been my passion and pretty much the space that I've worked in most of my life. So I'm really happy to be here and hopefully having this great conversation with all of you today.
And Judy, I'd be remiss if I didn't note, Humber is one of the largest institutions in Canada. It's a polytechnic that offers degrees, diplomas, certificates, microcredentials, etc. So it's really a good example of an institution that focuses on helping learners journey in, through, and beyond and back again. to help them as they're looking at prior learning and transfer and so on. And of course, my dear colleague from UNESCO, Borhene. I'd love it if you could say hello to our audience.
Thank you, Joanne, and hello to all colleagues, to Anne-Marie and Judy. I think I'm first of all an ambassador of GDN, as we have celebrated that end of last year. But just to say that I think the topic today that we are discussing on lifelong learning and microcredentials in ways at the center of the work I'm doing. First, in terms of policies and program on lifelong learning, from early learning to adult education and learning, and taking lifelong and life-wide perspective. But of course, all the work my team is doing in the implementation of the Global Convention on the recognition of higher education qualifications. And that's, of course, is about leaving no one behind. It's about ensuring that every student and every learner has her or his own qualification and skills recognized in a fair and transparent manner. And that's about international commitment, but it's also about the values, I think, that we share all, about how we ensure that this recognition is supporting further learning, is supporting lifelong learning, supporting also thriving into economies and societies at large. So I think what brings me is, I would say, this twin attention to lifelong learning and also to the recognition of qualification mobility within and across borders, and would be very happy to engage today. And over to you, Joanne.
Thanks so much, Borhene. And I just want to say, today's conversation, we're looking at kind of pushing at the potential advantages of using microcredentials to aid admissions and transfer. I think it's the secret to achieving some scalable evenness to providing opportunities for learners through recognition. And I want to explore with my colleagues some of the frictions that might be impeding adoption of microcredentials as part of that process, and what kind of instruments are out there that we can lean on, policy instruments like the Global Convention, to help our local communities at our institutions and in government to be thinking about these things when they're reviewing acts or policy documents locally, to see what more they need to shift and change to enable an environment that allows us to use microcredentials to aid admissions and transfer. So without further ado, though, I do always have to ask this question. And before I do, let me reiterate what my colleagues put in the chat to all of you. We have people from all over the world participating in this webinar today. Please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A, and I will keep an eye on those, and I'll weave them into my discussion with my colleagues today and see what additional insights they might be able to offer myself as well as all of you as we look at this space of advancing opportunities through the use of microcredentials. The first question I kind of want to ask, and I always ask this because I think it's kind of important, it helps set the stage. I'm going to start with Anne-Marie, and I'm going to say, what brings you to this space? What is the passion, or why do you think this is an important area to explore?
Thanks, Joanne. So many possible answers. I think that key reasons are about the learner, are about the success of the learner, and truly seeing that mobility is a connecting point to a pathway. It does give you access, it increases equity of access, it increases opportunity, careers, education, all of those key pieces that take through that admissions and also transfer journey to be able to truly connect those 2 points for the learner. And it's not a linear journey, right? And we see regularly in our work what I often refer to as the lost that need to be found. And there's so much that can be done through our collaboration. And I think in bringing to bear on this passion that certainly I personally have, having spent maybe more than a couple of years in the field of both secondary and post-secondary, previously an instructor, now PCCAT, ACAT, etc. I really have seen that journey through the years of how increasing the different tools, policies, and mechanisms to support that access can make a difference. And there's so much afoot right now that I'm truly inspired by to share some of those pieces with you. Everything from some Alberta pieces from the Alberta Post-Secondary Microcredentials Forum to PCCAT and BC Credit Bank and TRU with an exciting data initiative that is brand new and moving forward with data standards. The key piece about quality assurance that's starting also with PCAT in Ontario. I think also the Uruk Micreds piece, very much so with an XML structure. There's just a few possibilities, but when you start to put these parts together, I just get very excited about trying to make a difference in this space and doing so truly with the collaborative strength that we have together and not separately.
Yeah, I have to say, when I started in this field back in 1990 till present day, there's been a different feeling. There's a real convergence happening. And I think some of what we'll hear today will give us inspiration and ideas. Judy, what brings you to this work? You've been at this a while.
Yeah, you were here when I started, Joanne, actually. So such a great mentor for me. So, you know, to follow up with Anne-Marie's point, I mean, I have two things I would say for sure. What brings me to this space is the learner. I manage, you know, a frontline operation every day with subject matter experts that are talking to students all day long, you know, 5 days a week, sometimes on the weekends as well. And so that learner focus is really what brings me to this space. All the unique stories that they bring just, you know, are super inspiring to the work. But again, for us, it's really about how we meet the student where they're at. So we always have that lens of trying not to make them fit into our policies, practices, and procedures, which as big institutions, that's what we always try to do. So I've always taken the approach of trying to kind of push those pieces based on what the learner needs. So this space has really allowed for me to do that, both professionally and personally, and as a leader and a manager in this area. So I've been very fortunate to be able to do that. And part of that is because of the strategic direction of the institution that I work for. So RPL is part of our academic plan. It's part of our strategic plan. It's part of Humber's vision for 2030. So very fortunate to have that space to work in, and also the people who are willing and passionate to work in this space. And from another hat, I also am a recruitment and marketing person. So I really come at this from a strategic enrollment management perspective. I really feel that RPL, microcredentials, credit transfer pathways are a strategic enrollment management you know, initiative. We can use this to, you know, recruit, convert, and retain our students. And it really is something that I'm passionate about and try to weave through, you know, all of the advocacy work that I do at Humber, you know, provincially and pan-Canadian wide. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting as I listen to you both. I'm thinking, you know, not only does it serve a strategic local value, but just the social justice piece and the opportunity to make a difference in people's lives. I think many of the people that we have attending today, that's a real driver for them to contribute to this work. And I know, Borhene, you and I have had many a conversation. Thank you for mentioning you're a GDN ambassador. For those on the line, becoming a GDN ambassador is a big deal. It means this is an individual who's really gone above and beyond to help advance learner mobility. When I think about the work you do at UNESCO, I think it would be useful for our colleagues to also learn a little bit about the global convention, because it kind of sets the stage for lifelong learning.
Indeed, and I think, John, you put a very important point regarding the social justice agenda, and in a way, of course, I think what Anne-Marie and Judy mentioned, the individual or the learner at the center remains, I think, a driving, I would say, force for our action. But we take it from UNESCO from a multilateral perspective and putting it at the global dialogue. And I think that link with the Sustainable Development Agenda, it may sound a bit remote, we are speaking about individuals and the recognition of their skills or their qualification. But the link with the SDGs is very critical, is that we are not offering just a recognition of skills. We are linking it with how this can help, for example, finding decent job, how this can help gender equality. And decent job is about SDG 8. Gender equality is about SDG 5. It's about poverty reduction, and that's SDG 1. So there are those linkages are very important. And I think it's important that we see the contribution of our discussion in this broader agenda of a sustainable development. But to achieve that, we need also a broader, I would say, aspect. And that's what the Global Convention can bring, is that we know that people are mobile. They're not only mobile at the local level or at the country level, they're mobile across borders. And if we are to ensure that this, I would say, objective of offering a way to recognize the skills in different contexts and through different modalities, a global convention like the one we have adopted on the recognition of higher education is an important, or say, framework for it. Because first of all, it gives us a common language, common framework, but it engages the state parties. When you ratify the convention, you are accepting all what it entails in terms of processes, values, goals, including the validation of prior learning, including other aspects. And maybe we'll come back to that, because for me, the Global Convention is an illustration of a lifelong learning perspective and in its different provisions. So I think even if we take it from, I would say, a broad agenda, but it has to impact the individuals and has to lead to changing the situation on the ground. And that's what I think the Global Convention and the regional conventions, which are also important, because the system is a regional convention and the Global Convention. There is an interplay between the regional and the Global Convention that would be happy to cover as well. Over to you.
Well, and Borhene, when you make that point, and I would encourage our audience, if you have one action from today's webinar, is to actually Google the UNESCO Global Convention. Just take a peek at it, because it's actually reflective of the work that so many of you are already doing. And it's validation. That's what I love about it. I didn't see anything there that felt offside of the work I've been doing for 3 decades. It just helped to frame it in a broader context, and it certainly helped me to explain it forward. Borhene, I want to ask you a follow-up though.
Please.
If we think of micro-credentials, you go from the strategic of the Global Convention, and then we think of the practical realities of the experience of obtaining a micro-credential. How do you see that connection? How would you explain it to our audience? And furthermore, its connection to advanced admissions and transfer. Any thoughts around that space?
Yeah, maybe just to start with some data, because I think it's important. By now, we have around 35 countries that ratified the Global Convention. And when we take the regional and the Global Convention, we have around 100 countries that ratified either a regional or the global or both. And I think it's important to show a bit that there is a large number of countries that I would say align with the spirit, with the vision, with the approach that is proposed in the global and the regional convention. That's very important. Second, that the 35 countries, we have low-income countries like Capo Verde, we have middle-income countries like Tunisia, and we have also high-income countries like Japan or Australia, France, etc. So the Global Convention is, I would say, genuine global in the sense that it covers different income level. It covers different regions as well. We have all the regions represented, and the state parties have ratified the convention. And the last and not least is we have from the smallest country in the world, San Marino, with a very few thousand of students, to a large number of students, like in Japan, which is more than 3 million students. And all in all is around 19 million students that are by now out of the 35 countries in terms of enrollment. I think it's important to give that scale and what does it entail. Second, I mean, to respond to your question, Joanne, in the convention, there are different items or different provisions that are driving the recognition of qualification within lifelong learning perspective, including micro-credential, although it's not nominated as such. But the convention does encourage the state parties to recognize partial studies. It does support countries or require countries, state parties to recognize the prior learning. It does also require information and guidance on the opportunities and on the recognition modalities. It also recognizes the admission qualification. So it's not only higher education qualification, also the requirement in terms of admission qualification. And last but not least, it does also recognize or require state parties to recognize refugees and displaced persons qualification, including non-documented qualification. So in a way, the convention, the global convention, as well as the regional convention, entails a different lifelong learning dimension that are important to address what you are referring to. So I think that's how I see it, advancing the recognition, the microcredit or microcredential, and also admission and credit transfer as the convention requires. So I think, and to add to that, what Judy and I think Anne-Marie was referring, it also refers to the quality assurance procedures that have to be in place and the information process that have to be ensured so that the individuals have the best information, but is also a fair recognition and free information to access to free information on a higher education system. I think all these are driving for what you were suggesting earlier, Joanne.
I think it sets the foundation. And I do notice in our audience, we have wonderful organizations represented. Michael Ringet represents CSIC, which is an arm of the Council of Ministers of Education Canada. Canada ratified the Lisbon Recognition Convention, and I know he might have some comments in the chat about the status towards the Global Recognition Convention, if he so chooses, and we can share it with colleagues. We also have eCampus Ontario on the line, and they've done some wonderful work with building up the ecosystem to support micro-credentials in the region in Ontario and extended beyond that. And there's a few others on the call. Judy, I want to take the question over to you. I was so thrilled to see recently that Humber had made an announcement about the goals and objectives towards seamless transfer. They're one of the largest purveyors of micro-credentials, possibly in the country. And we have ONCAT that's done, the Ontario Council on Articulation and Transfer, that's done some good work. You're tied as well to one of the application centers in Ontario. From a micro-credential lens, tell us a little bit about the Humber story and some of this work that I've highlighted that you think teases to the surface some exemplar practices related to recognition in this space.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that overview. So Humber is definitely positioning ourselves as a leader in this space, which, we have been for many years. Like I said, this has been part of our strategic plan. Being a Polytechnic, pathways and RPL are just what we do every day. It's how our education is delivered. And of course, there's, in terms of the micro-credential space, so micro-credentials currently live in what's considered our continuous and professional learning. So for some people, that might be their CE world or their part-time world. Everyone is calling it different things, but at Humber, we call it continuous and professional learning. And that's where the majority of our micro-credentials are developed. There is a quality assurance framework that is applied to these micro-credentials that are quite stringent, probably more stringent than any other school at this point. It is based on, you had mentioned eCampus Ontario. So, our micro-credentials are aligned with the eCampus Ontario principles and frameworks, but we also continue to build on that with our own quality assurance processes. And our colleagues in our program planning and development and our CPL area work very hard. And we are actually launching a new framework this fall specifically for CPL and micro-credential. So that really is about, applying those quality assurance practices to all things that are what would be now considered non-credit. So that is a really good step forward for us in the transfer world, because the question always is, well, what's the transfer function? What's the transferability of micro-credentials to the full-time world? And that really is the space that I work in, and am advocating for. So now that we have those foundations and very strong foundations in the quality assurance side, we are going to be starting to build. Right now, we actually use the PLAR process to identify students or to validate the learning from a micro-credential into a full-time program. We want to get past that, I think, because of the fact that we are putting in the work at the development stage with this new framework that, I think will help make it a more seamless process. And back to, the enrollment piece, again, I see when you have that in place, you're able to use those pathways as, a recruitment and retention strategy. Many of our learners can't come back full time. They don't have, the capacity at the time, whether it's funding or family obligations, but they want to do something. And those micro-credentials are a great way of getting them back into the educational space, but also them knowing that there is the possibility to transfer that learning to a full-time program is where we want to get things, because eventually they might want to come and do a certificate or a diploma or even a degree. So that is the space that Humber is working in, and I would say that's unique probably right now to some of the other colleges. And then again, we could use that for admissions purposes as well. So right now we do use sometimes a PLAR-based type of portfolio for some of our credentials. It's a little bit more ad hoc at this point, but I think this framework will actually help support the admissions pieces as well. Yeah.
Well, I want to do a little bit of a nod to our audience. They're asking some good questions. And I think your answer kind of delicately wove the needle through the tapestry to sort of explain. You have to get the core foundations, the quality assurance framework, nesting it in principles. One of the questions, and I'll just cite the questions for you. One of them is, how can the UNESCO Global Convention help to enable standardization, not only within an institution, but across, is how I'm interpreting the question. And another sort of talked about, there's a perception about academic rigor in the micro-credential universe, which I find fascinating, particularly when it's backed by a quality assurance framework and quality assurance assessment practices. I think the question, I'm going to throw these questions out to you, and I'm going to start with Anne-Marie because you work in government, Anne-Marie, and you have examples from the country that you've been polling your colleagues on. Where do you think there's some examples where such standardization across institutions, or perhaps within an institution on the QA realm, the quality assurance realm, has helped to or holds the promise of removing barriers to recognition of micro-credentials for admission and transfer?
Yeah, absolutely, Joanne. And I think grounding ourselves maybe in some of the aspects of the convention, like Article 3 about qualifications should be transparent, fair, timely, that decisions should be based on trust, clear criteria, fair and transparent, those kinds of really good foundational pieces. I think springboarding that into a number of items, in some cases seeing that you've got, of course, some of the different aspects related to the UNESCO definition, and seeing that as well, the common definition of micro-credentials being applied as well. And as that gets layered out, you'll see that in different institution frameworks. You will see that also in, if I were to give a few specific examples here, I think that some of the key examples around implementing that in key definitions and guidelines and frameworks for quality assurance, I think the recent work on an Ontario microcredential definition and quality assurance proposed framework by PCAP is a very important piece of work that our ONCAT and Ontario colleagues would certainly highlight. And I would see great benefit in the ability for that to take us somewhere and to have some additional conversations, because to the best of my knowledge, it's the first true one that's existed in the country. Also, I think building on the work that's just underway and moving forward with PCCAT and the BC Credit Bank in looking at, and with Thompson Rivers University, the microcredential data project and standards. There's a number of really key pieces, I think, there around also grounding that in what can we see about operationally. We've been talking, all of us, a great deal about, yes, we've got many barriers. We absolutely do, related to no common shared framework or recognized criteria. CSIC and ourselves have had that chat as well. We all understand this. We've chatted about that with Micreds, also with others. But how do we still move forward? And institutions have the students in front of them. We can't wait, as you say. So yes, we desperately do need to find a way to bring together some of these examples, see a common shared framework and recognize criteria and data standards, I think, for credential recognition related to microcredentials. And I might add how that connects to transfer, how that connects to PLAR or other aspects such as that, because they're not in a vacuum, right? And I think too, there's a CSA project related to trying to do something similar to this with metadata standards. There is also, I think, quite importantly, the XML structure that Micreds is putting in place with the virtual skills passport and the digital wallet with some CanPest collaboration. When I start to look at some of these, I think, key pieces and where they can take us, and on top of that, all of the important work that so many institutions are doing, that is such a long list. One item I know folks were quite excited about was the released University of Alberta non-credit framework very recently as well. But there's so many examples. I think bringing those pieces together to try to address the key issues that we see, that non-credit to credit pathways, the needing a common recognition and data standard framework, breaking that down, I think we've got some really great new pieces that are happening now that weren't happening before. We need to coalesce those together. And I think there's the ability to see the operations beyond the barrier, because the barriers don't ever really fully go away. We find ways, as we all do with the great work that we do, because it matters, to start to put it in place one step at a time, right?
So if I was to, I'm just gonna pull some threads here and
Yes.
be clear. Some of the barriers that I've noticed in my journey, and I'm looking for nodding heads if you agree. And the question we saw in the chat is a good example. A local sort of perception about micro-credentials more broadly makes maybe a resistance, shall we say, to looking at individual ones that have gone through a rigorous process. So there's just a global perception regarding them. I see some nodding heads. Another barrier.
If I may, I'm sorry, Paul, I was just gonna say, related to, I think that push-pull between the purpose is so important. The upskilling and the really direct application to career, business, industry, and the dialogue about, is stackability feasible? And if it is, how? I just want, I think that that's really key as a part of the item.
So the original purpose for which the micro-credentials or series of micro-credentials have been designed can have an implication in terms of their receptivity towards using certain micro-credentials for admission and transfer. Totally get that. I will do a shout out from my own work. There's some good work in New Zealand with their qualifications framework, where they've identified the levels where they recognize micro-credentials, approved micro-credentials that are not necessarily always from the academic setting, and it goes all the way up to the graduate level. We also have examples of the good work of people like Nan Travers at SUNY in the US. There's some wonderful work in Europe in terms of recognition of micro-credentials. We've talked a little bit about here in Canada. Borhene, are there any exemplars out there that have identified barriers and brought them the solution forward that works, that you know of, that you can share with us?
No, thank you. I think the example you just mentioned, New Zealand and Australia, their efforts to level the micro-credential on their national qualification framework seems to me a very critical move, because that's what will give value to the micro-credential, but also place that in a lifelong learning perspective, meaning you are part of that framework. And I think that entry point is very important. The other barrier is, of course, access to learning. And I think we just assume that people are engaged in learning. We can see from different data we have is that less than 5% of adults are engaged in a lifelong learning, call it experience or path. So I think that barrier, particularly for the less skilled persons, sometimes for gender, sometimes for minority, for persons with disability. So that equity and social equity dimension that you mentioned earlier, Joanne, is a very important aspect. And the funding for micro-credential is another piece that we have been looking at. But we have, in our analysis, we have identified around 70 countries who have a training fund that funds upskilling, reskilling. So there is a source for funding that exists. Some countries like France, Singapore, recently Korea, they have adopted lifelong learning entitlements that offers individuals a voucher or a credit, financial, to engage in a lifelong learning and benefit from micro-credentials or other form of partial learning that can be stacked or not, as I think Judy and Marie were referring to. I think one of the challenges that we see also is that if the funding goes only to micro-credential, that might drift from an attention to full qualifications. And we know that the stability in the labor market may require more than a micro-credential that you get in specific moments. So I think that that aspect is also very important. I think the question regarding, can we have a standardization across the board through the global convention? I think you referred to that also, Joanne, in the beginning. The global convention gives the foundation for further engagement. It gives the guiding principles. Can we reach a global standard? I would be very careful on global standard. I would say that the transparency of the standards, the understanding of the standard, the information on the standard might be more powerful than trying to have one global standards on the transfer and the digital, particularly when it comes to technology, because in any case, at least UNESCO is not a regulatory body for technology. We are putting guiding principles like ethics in the use of digital technology and AI. I think that links a bit to the global convention is not separate from a broader ecosystem that has to take into account other engagement. And for example, I mentioned AI, I mentioned also open data and open science. So there are other aspects that UNESCO and probably broadly UN is advancing that we will need to take into account in this exercise. We tried to do, and we have done this a few years ago, to come to, we call it a common definition on micro-credential. It's not a standardized definition, it's a common definition, which is trying to say we need common language. I think that's really the starting to remove some of the barriers, that we understand each other. And common language doesn't mean one language. It may mean our capacity to understand different languages. Over to you.
I 100% agree, Borhene. And actually, one of our colleagues in the chat talked about common data standards. That doesn't mean that the content is standardized. It just means that the train and the pathways that's moving from one part A to part B is clear, and that we understand what's coming in. And I think when I think about the work, and this is really kind of a global question, I don't know who wants to take this, so maybe they can raise their hands. My sense is you have to get the policy foundations in your local context aligned. Incentive funding helps to remove barriers for access and opportunity, as well as scalable technology innovation. But you need to get that first layer figured out. Do you agree that policy is one of those, local policy is a key thing, anchored in the principles of some of the global instruments and broader instruments and so on, is a good place for an organization or an institution to start? Who would like to take that? Borhene.
I don't want to speak loud, but I think it's an interplay in the sense that, of course, you need a national policy, and definitely otherwise you build on a vacuum. But national policy can be also informed and influenced, here in a positive sense, from the international agenda. And we have seen that, for example, if I take the right to education, this is something that was adopted in 1960, but that in a way created dynamic at the global level in terms of how we build the right to education in our national context, what policies we need, what measures, and those are highly contextualized. The problem in Canada, and even in Canada across the territories, whom you know better than me, are different. But when we take it at the global scale, in contexts where there are low resources, in contexts where you have for example, not an independent agency for quality assurance, information centers, etc. So I think there is an interplay, and I do believe that the global convention, as an example, but other international instruments can also drive national policies. But obviously, at the end of the day, this has to trickle down at the national and sometimes at the local level. So I would say there is an interplay, a dialectical approach, if I can use a kind of epistemological concept. Over to you.
I want to do a little bit of a shout out for one of our signatories, Credential Engine in the US. They've done some really great work identifying and creating a standard for exchanging content across multiple types of credential types that a learner might have. There's also, Borhene mentioned some special projects for displaced persons, and where they can't access their documents, but they still want to benefit from future opportunity and learning regardless of their circumstance. So how do we help them, and how do we recognize their learning? So maybe I'll turn this question to our Anne-Marie. Any thoughts or suggestions for our audience here? This cuts to that barrier piece about access that one of our audience members and what Borhene amplified as well. Any suggestions there for an institution or a province or state or a government, how to move the needle here?
I think in moving the needle on access, and to also connect it to your previous comment and great response there, Borhene, I think that when you look at implementation of anything, the true implementation always happens at the local level. It always happens when it's truly working, in this case, at an institution or an organizational level, directly in different areas with the learner. And we have many times seen that something gets developed here and it doesn't happen here at the local level. I think truly good policy, both jurisdictionally, I understand, of course, have to acknowledge that we all know that education is a provincial jurisdiction here in Canada. However, that doesn't mean that we haven't had effective and can't have continually effective national collaboration and also between institution collaboration. And there's great examples of this. And I think that's part of our access barriers, having enough tools and supports that help to support the institution work so that it can happen. Some of those can be very difficult for us each, and we all are. If there's one thing from collecting this information, I see it is very clear that there's much good work happening everywhere, but separately in so many different ways, because we have to also be operationalizing our work right now. We could be saving a lot of time and effort if we had a better mechanism, and I'm looking at some possibilities here for how we can share. Even right now, we're discussing these different pieces of research, but we need a way to say, okay, here are the key pieces, here's how they can implement, and who's going to take that next step. Is it PCCAT? Is it whom? No, I'm not committing for the board here, but
Yeah.
breaking down access needs to see the tools to put in place, and that includes data standards and definitions, I think, to truly get recognition as a key piece for breaking it down. I think that if we're able to share some of our BC colleagues' work, they're checking on that, but I think that will really be a benefit to trying to say, how do we take this next step? I think access does come back to recognition, and recognition comes back to how are we tracking the decisions and agreements and data that give the learner access to information to make that happen. And how do we support institutions, since it's so costly to do that? I think sharing information initially, sharing our data initially, and also seeing the broader connection both jurisdictionally and nationally, so we can help to make that happen. And Borhene's comment, I think, to bring it together, is it's about shared standards, not everything perfectly identical. We've got shared criteria, we've got common criteria. I think that's going to break down the access barrier.
So one of the things that you said, Borhene, which resonates with me, and I love having Humber here actually, because they're an example of, and we have True on the line. We have other examples from around the world, some good work happening with creating a new quality assurance agency in the US, et cetera, for recognition. I could keep going. There's so many examples, even amongst the people on the line and beyond us. But one of the reasons I asked Judy here is, we have a question in the chat, how do we take this forward? So you've been taking forward, you've created a QA framework. You have been doing some policy work. You have been doing advocacy work. If somebody is wanting to recognize microcredentials and transfer, what do you recommend coming locally from an institution as your step one? Any thoughts in that space, Judy? And sorry to put you on the spot there.
That's a big question. I think that for anyone who works at a post-secondary and a college, specifically in Ontario, you know the ins and outs of the workings of a big institution, and how there are internal barriers between the academic side of the house and the operational side of the house and the student service side of the house. So for me, it really has been doing that work internally to build a transfer culture. And I've been at this for about 9 years, and I think I Googled how long does it take to build an institutional culture, and I think it's 10. So we're almost there, but the approach that I really took as an operational manager, that's what I am. I am not the lead on quality assurance. I am not the lead on the academic side of the house, but I see myself as the student voice, and my team is the student voice. So it's really about continuing to bring those real life scenarios and situations and stories to the people who are making these decisions. So that's really the approach I have taken from the position I have here. And I think that is what has helped to broach some of the internal barriers that we may have about perceptions, like you said, Joanne. Even when it came to transfer credit, there were a lot of perceptions when I first started about awarding individual transfer credit, let alone microcredentials into a full-time, program. So that's the approach that I've taken. It's easier said than done, of course, especially at a really big institution, but, leading with the student voice has really, I think, been the most impactful for the work that we have done and have been able to do here over the past 10 years. And I think it's having a leadership team that values that. And again, there's always going to be, like Anne Marie said, there's system barriers. Our systems are not built for transferability, for recognition of prior learning, even just
You're talking
acknowledging
about technology systems.
technology. Yes, our systems, everything from the application center, right? The Ontario College's application center, it's not built for an adult learner, although 65% of the learners who are coming to us are not high school students, right? So we know that we need to do a lot of work from a systems perspective in terms of even just changing the mindset of how we are recruiting, marketing, processing, advising, all of those pieces, the learners that we have on campus. So I do feel right now there is I don't know if it's an educational renaissance or we're going through something right now where I think, the value of the value that adults bring to the learning environment is really top of mind, and recognition of prior learning is everyone's priority right now. It has become, at least in Ontario, that's the conversations that we're having, both at the college and the university level. People, seeing our university partners perk up when we talk about RPL is a big deal for us because it's not traditionally a university initiative. But again, everyone is seeing that value because, again, back to the lifelong learning piece, the reality is it doesn't stop after 2 years or 4 years. And if, again, bringing in the enrollment, I know sometimes we don't want to talk about competition, but the reality is when we work at an institution, there is strategic enrollment management that comes into play. And so, we're all looking for those opportunities to bring those learners in. And that means that we have to change what we're offering them.
I like the use of the word renaissance, and I'm just going to draw that thread, and I'm going to expand it to say that recognizing microcredentials for admission and transfer brings us into an opportunity to help contribute to the lifelong learning renaissance that's emerging. I do think what I've heard from listening to all of you, the barriers are many and the solutions are not easy. So the other thing that struck me as I was listening to all of you is our job in part has been to share with our community on the call and others just the potential pillars that we can lean on to help us as we're going through step 1, step 2, and making this happen nationally, provincially, at an institution, or even more broadly. So I just want to tease a couple of those pillars to the surface and seek whether or not I'm hearing you and I'm on the right track. One of the things to help make change in this regard is to lean on key instruments, that policy instruments that can help convince, persuade, anchor the change renaissance that's underway. And one of those pillars, for example, Borhene, is the Global Convention. The other thing, do you all agree with me with a nod of the head? Yes, yes. The other thing I heard is to recognize the local context. So if we use Canada as a microcosm, we do not have a national Department of Education. Creating national policy, one policy across the board is very challenging. It's very much a country that's based on preserving the principles of autonomy and authority at the local level, whether provincially or institutionally. That's not going anywhere. And that's not unusual. There's other countries that have the same context and reality. And then there's other countries or regions where you can actually have centralized defining regulations and centralization, which presents a foundational opportunity. So I think it's about recognizing the context that you're in and thinking about leveraging global instruments, for example, or research to help create the evidentiary foundation for affecting that change renaissance. Is that something all of you agree with? Yeah. Is there any comment there? Borhene?
Yeah, thank you, Joanne. I think that's very, very clear, and obviously this interplay between the global and the local is critical. I mean, few things that I think are important, also responding to the question. One is that we can also take a right-based approach in here. And for now, for example, the validation of prior learning is not an entitlement everywhere. It's something that you may have access to, but you may not. It's something that you may have access to at specific level of qualification, but not on others. So I think taking the right basic perspective and saying validation of prior learning is an entitlement to every individual and every citizen. And it comes with other entitlements, which is access to information, which is about career guidance and counseling, which is about the learning opportunities. So I think that's if we take a right basic perspective, that can also think about this equity and inclusion and social justice that you mentioned earlier. And this can be reflected, and it is reflected in the Global Convention. And that's why one of our objectives is to have more countries ratifying the convention, because we have 35, but we have 192 member states. So we would like to have a large number of member states who ratify, and that means align with the guiding principles and the values and the more humanistic and right-based perspective that we are bringing. And at the end of the day, if I have a vision to share, I think we need an international area for higher education cooperation and solidarity. Cooperation because we need to exchange, we need to collaborate, but solidarity because some countries are advanced than others, some contexts are advanced than others, and we need that solidarity so that we can share the knowledge, we can share the experience, and we can work interculturally and inter countries. That's what I think drives us as UNESCO, but I'm sure it drives all colleagues who are engaged in this exercise. Over to you.
Yeah, one of the things that Wayne, by the way, had several suggestions for how to move forward. And because we have our government colleagues on the line, or government-funded agencies, they serve as incentivizers as well as enablers to help affect system-level change. And I think they have an important role to play to help advance recognition of microcredentials for admission and transfer. The other thing I would suggest, there's the social justice piece, the access piece, the institutional context, etc. But there's also a labor mobility piece here, which we don't have time to talk about today, but I want to make sure I put a pin in it to say that it benefits economies when we help people, when we recognize learning in all its different ways and formats, and we help get them readied and out into the job market quickly, and we support them with cross-skilling and subsequent upskilling. And I think these micro-credentials can help with that as well. So wasn't the focus of our discussion today, but I just want to make sure we put a pin on that. I want to thank our wonderful guests for sharing your thoughts and perspectives, and also pinning some exemplar practices. We haven't answered all the questions fully because it's a big topic. We do, however, plan, in good partnership with our PCCAT colleagues, a May 28th, 29th, 30th convening in Toronto at Centennial College, who's graciously lending their space, so that we can bring to colleagues together nationally and internationally to continue the dialogue. Borhene has kindly agreed to speak at that event, and we'll have other featured speakers from both PCCAT and the GDN network and beyond joining us from across the globe. We hope you're able to attend. We also have our Oslo, Norway convening in late October, where it'll be our annual convening to bring together digital and policy mobility experts and thought giants from around the world to help us keep moving forward with this network of networks work we're doing. We're planning other webinars. We have a credential engine 3-part series starting very soon. I think it's next week. It's on our website. We invite you to join us if that's an area that you're interested in, moving courses and credential information around. And we're planning a 5-part series with Velocity Network Foundation that looks at the area of trust. Because at the end of the day, the work that we're all doing here is about people and change. And as a GDN network, our job is to help create convening opportunities to build knowledge, to build information, transparency about what's going on around the world. Thank you, my friends. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to future collaborations and conversations.
Thank
Take
you. Thank
care.
you, Joanne,
Thanks,
Anne-Marie,
everyone.
and Judy, and all colleagues. Bye.
Thank you.